Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to WatchBox, and thanks for logging on. If you're not watching this on the new WatchBox app, you're doing it all wrong. New features available on the Apple App Store or Google Play. You'll see WatchBox Studios content 1 week early, exclusive on the app. Plus, you can read editorial content from our own Jack Foster and your favorite third-party watch journals, magazines, and blogs. Also, shop our inventory, browse 3,000 pre-owned and vintage luxury watches while also storing your collection, including details of condition, box, and papers. Finally, stay in touch with me, my team, and our entire family of WatchBox client advisors around the world. I'm Tim, and I'll see you on the app. Hi, I'm Tim, he's Brian, this is Perpetually Patek. If there's one general truth about Patek Philippe limited editions, it's that they tend to arrive in waves. Anniversaries, exhibitions, these are usually the source of the most memorable and most numerous Patek special pieces. I want to announce up front that there are many of them, and we're going to dedicate entire episodes to certain anniversaries and certain local exhibitions. Today, we speak of the 2014 175th anniversary, as well as the 2016 arrival of the anniversary Nautilus. Brian, I know that you have strong feelings about the inflection point represented by that 2014 era and the anniversary. Product aside, what were you sensing?
So I had the privilege of being a part of the moment. Flew over to Switzerland for the launch of the product and the festivities. And these anniversaries come, as you mentioned, every 25 years. So we were celebrating the 175th anniversary of the brand. And for me in 2014, it was this real inflection point, right? You had changing in the demographics of the clients. They were getting younger. Social media was taking a bigger role in terms of the proliferation of product, launches. You had more individual clients expressing their opinions online. You had more online trade press, I would say, speaking about these different launches. And so in the past, where the information would come from the retailer to the client, you now had, for me, really one of the first times where clients were reading about these launches online while it was happening.
And it was fascinating because this was sort of a coming out party for the Terry Stern era. He became the president of the company in 2009, and you better believe to launch this collection took half a decade's running start. And he really put his stamp on these 175th anniversary pieces. So doing a quick rundown of the lineup, it was like a dream team. I think the piece that everyone remembers is the Grand Master Chime. We may as well start at the top. 7 pieces, 20 complications, the most complex Patek wristwatch ever, and their first rotating case.
No, exactly. A truly remarkable watch to have been launched, and something that I think no collector out there would have expected. The watch itself remains their most complicated wristwatch today, albeit in many different iterations, but still the same movement. The other watch that I think was the darling of the show was the 5575 World Time. So this was the launch of a brand new case for the World Time. It featured also for the first time a moon phase on the dial. So no World Time prior to that, particularly this reference line, had had a moon phase. Black dial, star constellations, I mean, just absolutely spectacular. And for those clients that don't know, when you go back to 2014, it wasn't all about the Aquanaut and Nautilus craze. Some of the most coveted watches at the time were the Cloisonné enamel 5131 series that they had produced in several metals. And this watch was really speaking to those collectors because this was a watch that lots of clients were not able to get. And I think that for the first time, this 5575 was like, oh my God, here's going to be a watch that's going to be available and I may be able to purchase it.
And it was fantastic because a lot of people think, oh, it's a 5130 with a moon phase. No, it's not. It's a different case. It's a different dial. It is the photorealistic moon phase. It's, of all things, a solid case back, as just about all of the anniversary pieces were. And despite making 1,300 pieces, demand was nowhere near satisfied. You have to remember, at the time, auctions, the secondary market, the hottest Patek Philippe watches tended to be complications and dress watches in 2014. This was both, and despite that production run of 1,300, they rarely come up on the market.
And you saw almost a slight shift in the product direction, not fully, but you saw it going a little bit more youthful, right?
Yes.
To me, that this watch was a little bit more modern, a little bit more youthful. And, obviously we see today a completely different landscape in terms of product, but this was sort of that starting point. And if you look at the other watches that launched for the anniversary, you had the 5975, which was a solid caseback chronograph featuring a multi-scale dial, which, you can draw a direct line between that watch and watches at the museum. And you had, which I think is your favorite of the show, the 5275, which is a triple jump hour, jump minute, jump second, on a hand-engraved gold dial. Oh, can't forget the hour gong.
Yes, hour striker, in addition to a jump.
In addition to a jump. But just a truly special, miraculous watch produced in 175 pieces. And again, when we speak about drawing inspiration from prior launches, if you go back 25 years, you had the 3968 in 1950, which was a jump hour with a minute hand, but a lot smaller, a little bit more tonneau in shape, almost what you would call a lady's watch in size today.
Yes, the 5275 is my favorite on a couple of different levels. It's beautiful artisanally. It has an engraved case in platinum. It has an engraved dial in gold. It is a triple jump, which is remarkable to see and actually makes the watch look like it might be electronic when you encounter it in person. But you don't encounter it that much. And I would have thought 175 examples of something like this might be more than the market could swallow. But again, they never appear. If there's one truism about all of these watches from the 2014 anniversary, except maybe the 5975, it's that you don't see them pre-owned that often. People knew they were special at the time. A lot of them went into long-term collections, and very few of them were flipped at the time. There's a secondary market for everything, but Patek Philippe did an incredible job vetting the people who bought these, and the collectors, for their part, tended to keep the faith.
And we've seen very few of that watch over time, that's for sure. But one of the other special items that launched were two different ladies' watches. Yes. One that was a smaller diamond set version of the World Time, and the other a smaller version of the chronograph with also a diamond set dial. But for me, what was pivotal about this was larger sizes. I mean, this was the first time where I think they were saying, you know what, women want larger watches. Sizing is going to transition to being a little bit more ambiguous. Again, I think that's why they were so successful at the launch.
Yeah, the 7175 Ladies World Time was basically a slightly smaller rose gold diamond set version of the men's World Time moon phase. And by slightly, I mean the men's was 39.8 and the ladies was 38. This was not a huge step down. We had a 4675. We had that same chronograph style in the 5975, but for ladies. And frankly, this was the beginning of Patek starting to look at ladies' watches as viably mechanical. I think before this, if you talk to Patek Philippe about ladies' watches, immediately they would say, ladies 24, 4910. And that was, for a long time, their best-selling watch overall. This was, even before the mechanical 24 arrived recently, a sign that Patek was beginning to sense women who were into watches wanted more or less what men were getting. They wanted to have a mechanical movement, traditionally crafted, and a case that wasn't so small you wouldn't be able to read the watch.
And so you had these two pieces that launched, and that sort of culminated the launches for the 175th. But you also had quite a few other rare handcrafts that launched on an individual or small batch basis that really brought it all home. And I know that we mentioned that we were going to talk about the exhibitions in the future, but the Saatchi Gallery exhibition in particular.
We can preview them.
Well, we don't. We'll save it for episodes, but it sort of happened in the same year, and that was sort of the end of the festivities is sort of all that I really wanted to mention.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to remember this as an era, not so much individual events. We saw that more youthful profile in company management with Terry Stern expressing itself in 2014. And I think we also saw it express itself in 2016. So for the 40th anniversary of the Nautilus, you have to remember what the market for the Nautilus looked like at the time. 5711s could be purchased close to retail, and by close to, I mean sometimes just below.
Yeah, I mean, these watches were available, right? You know, Aquanauts and Nautiluses were available in store. The demand of today was non-existent. Collectors were focusing on complications and Calatravas. To be perfectly honest, sport watches were more of an afterthought at the time. And so for Patek, this was a launch that actually went outside the grain somewhat of what many of their collectors were asking for. In particular, I think the curveball that was thrown was the fact that they were made in precious metals such as they were. So you had the 5976/1G, which was a 44 millimeter diameter chronograph with a diamond set dial in all white gold. Crazy hefty watch.
Yeah.
And then
I would even go so far as to say it is to the Nautilus what the offshore is to the Royal Oak.
No, and it's still to this day the largest Nautilus that's been launched. It may very well be the largest Nautilus that's ever launched. In addition to that, you had the 5711 1P with a blue diamond set dial. Now, the 5711 1P had been produced by special order in the past. I believe it was from 2005 to 2011.
Very rare watch.
Very, very rare watch without the diamond set. And so there was almost a precedent for this watch. But it was a watch that many, many collectors, most people didn't even know existed because it was never on catalog and never presented on the website. So you had these two launches, and when they launched, they were really being targeted towards pre-existing collectors of the brand. Given the fact that they were limited edition and they were scarce, but also the price point, right? These were $100,000 Nautiluses that weren't really just for your average passerby.
No, the 5711 in platinum was $113,400. The chronograph was $96,390. And they made a large number. For this kind of watch, at that price, you would have thought 700 platinum Nautilus automatics, 1,300 white gold chronographs. That's a lot. But I feel like they judged the market correctly because these were not being immediately flipped. They don't come on the market too often. The demand, even in 2016, before the current surge of interest in this type of watch, I think Patek nailed it. They pulled the old Ferrari strategy of figuring out what the market could bear and making one less than that.
No, I mean, listen, you know, at this stage, they have points of sale all throughout the world. So if you really take a look and you say, okay, how many doors do we have? How many different markets? It's really not that many per door. And these were really offered to their top collectors at the time, right? So in 2016, these collectors were focusing on big complications, 5270s, 5170s, right? So this was almost a supplement to those watches. And for me, it was a turning point because you were just starting to see that interest coming into place for sport. And as we mentioned earlier in the episode, these watches were being presented on social. You were reading about them more online. And so I think that this was the beginning of the audience for these watches also broadening.
Yeah, in the 90s you had magazines, in the 2000s you had websites, and by the 2010s social media was the scene where people got their information about watches. So this was a line definitely intended for a more youthful audience, by a more youthful Patek president, and to be disseminated through a more modern medium. There were some controversies, I'm not going to lie. If you measure that 44 millimeter Nautilus horizontally, we all know that if you measure a Nautilus side to side, it's going to be bigger. It's 49.35 millimeters, which is huge. The dial had a more saturated blue metallic color than a standard Nautilus. It wasn't slate blue, it was sort of like cobalt metallic. Diamond set indices, I think most people were okay with the baguette diamond indices. They were subtle, they were cool. It was the legend, the anniversary signature that tended to divide people. I'm okay with it, because when you look at the watch like this, you don't see it. When you look at the watch like this, you see it. But when was the last time you looked at your watch from 4 inches away?
No, I mean, you know what? The diamond markers at the time, I also think were, again, it was a curveball, right? Like they weren't so much as blingy as bringing more life to the watch itself. And we saw the introduction of diamond baguettes on other watches quite a few times since.
Yeah, back in 2014, the 4675, the ladies' version of the triple scale chrono. Yeah, diamond indices right there. And it mainstreamed a little bit in 2017 with the 5170p.
Correct.
So, which had a very similar blue metallic dial. So I feel like almost this Nautilus anniversary was a dry run for this idea of using diamond indices on a series watch.
Exactly. And you mentioned the embossed dial. And for me, you know what? I do think there was a little bit of a dividing point. in terms of some collectors saying, did it need to be on the dial or not? But for me, I was happy that it was there, right? This was a milestone watch. It was a limited edition piece. And it really didn't bother me in terms of the aesthetic of the dial. And as you mentioned, it was layered in and embossed in. And so unless you were looking very, very close, you couldn't really even see it was there.
Yeah, people blow it out of proportion because when you look at a watch online, it's blown out of proportion.
100%.
A watch that's this big on your computer monitor is going to show you things that you'll never see in real life. And I think history has vindicated the design because you could tell me what the markets are like for these, but let's just say higher than list.
No, for sure. I mean, I would say that the 5711 1Ps right now are bringing around 450 to 500,000, and the 5976s are pretty much the same.
Yeah, so ultimately this, I don't know if you want to call these trendsetters, but they've held their own as classics.
For sure. I mean, I would say that even now with all of the launches that have taken place over the last several years of different Nautiluses and Aquanauts, particularly the Nautiluses since we're talking about the anniversary, these two pieces still do very much stand at the top.
So what I find interesting about this whole era of the mid-2000s is that it was an era of commemorations, and a lot of what we saw initially, such as the World Time in 2014 or the Diamond Indices in 2016, in some ways it would filter out to the mainstream catalog. I don't want to call these research and development designs, but there's always a hint of the future when Patek does a limited edition.
No, for sure. And you know what? And you don't know exactly where and how it's going to come, but I think that for me, it was really the theme of a more modern design, and also the start of, let's call it, this sport watch craze.
Definitely, without a doubt. I think that puts a bow tie on it. That was a blast, and this was Perpetually Patek.